Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for having me. I saw that map at the beginning to say how far people have traveled to come to these symposia, and for me it wasn't quite as far, which isn't a bad thing. So I've got quite a few slides here today, mostly because I've spoken on the same agenda as Martin before, and often we overlap. So if I skip a couple of slides, it's because I think Martin has already covered it. And if there's a couple of things that you remember today from what I say, I think the first thing is food waste is tough, it's complex. I think some of the examples Martin gave show that often solutions, whether they are in companies or in homes or anywhere along the value chain, are the causes are different, and so the solutions are different. And so coming up with simple solutions is difficult. The other thing, I think, if you remember nothing else today, is that it's emotional. And I would argue, and I'm going to argue in the next couple of minutes, that we should stop calling it food waste. Because as soon as we say the word waste, people don't want to talk about it anymore. They get uncomfortable. And in fact, one of the biggest challenges we have is that we're pointing at industry and we're pointing at people and saying, you're wasting too much. And people shut down. They don't want to have anything to do with it. And I'll give you an example. This slide, my title slide, this is an actual photograph that I took when I was at a conference in San Diego. That is stenciled on the side of a great big dumpster, and it was next to 12 identical dumpsters that had food waste stenciled on the side, behind a fence at the back of Petco Field, which is the baseball diamond in San Diego. And I was reaching through the fence with my phone to take this picture, and they chased me away. Because they don't want to acknowledge. So they have to stencil it on there so that they know where to put the stuff that gets thrown out, but they don't want to acknowledge that it actually happens. On the same trip to San Diego, I was kicked off the grounds of Whole Foods for trying to take a picture of their dumpster at the back. One of the criticisms of Whole Foods is because they sell expensive, perfect food, they actually throw out more than other retailers do. I have no idea if that's true or not, but I do know that if you go try and take a picture of their dumpster, they will ask you gently to leave, which I did. So that trip to San Diego was the closest I've ever come to getting in trouble at a conference. So, what is food waste? I think that this is something that we need to think about a lot, because I'm sure if I went around this room and asked people, how do you define food waste, we'd all define it somewhat differently. And I think that, as much as the emotion, is one of the problems we have, because if I said, well, that's a waste, someone else will say, well, that's not a waste. That's a part of our system. And so understanding, again, looking at, I think, some of the things that Martin does where they talk about the entire flow, looking at where organic matter comes into the system and where organic matter goes out of the system and how that organic matter is used, we can take some of the emotion out of it and say, are we using resources as efficiently as we can? So what is food waste? I expect anyone who's ever spoken about food waste has one of these inverted triangles in it. And you know, at the bottom here is the stuff we throw out, right? If it's consumer, historically it's gone to landfill. Now it's going to composting. I don't want to steal too much of Molly's thunder. Molly and I work together, but if we throw it out, clearly that's bad. It's burned. It's sent to landfill, creates greenhouse gases. Clearly not a good use of resources, although there's some things that we end up doing that anyway. Recovery, where we burn it for energy or we put it into an anaerobic digester. Recycled, composted, feed it to animals, we redistribute it to people. Although some of the people in the food security area will argue that, well, if it's not good enough for us to eat, why are we giving it to people who are food insecure, right? So I think there are arguments, and there are food rescue organizations who will say, well, we're taking things that aren't necessarily getting thrown out or not necessarily not good enough for other people, but we're diverting it. So I think there's some value there. Where is the line here where it's waste? Is it only waste if we throw it out? Or is it waste if we produced it for someone to eat, but now we're going to burn it for energy, or we're going to anaerobically digest? Because people would argue, well, that's not really an efficient use of resources. We produce it in a field or in a greenhouse or somewhere, and then we're putting it into anaerobic digestion. The city of Toronto anaerobically digests all household food waste. Unfortunately, they haven't budgeted for the generation, so I think they're still flaring all of that methane they're producing. Is that wasted, or is that good diversion? Is food that is no longer put into the garbage, but now put into an organic stream like we do here in Guelph, is that wasted? It's going into organics. In fact, there's some evidence, sorry, Molly, there's some evidence that actually having an organic stream increases the amount of food we throw out. Because I'm doing something good. I no longer, it gets back to that guilt thing. I no longer have to feel guilty about what I'm throwing out. Right? And so we can go beyond this. I have a graduate student with whom I disagree with some frequency, who would argue that she's a vegetarian, who would argue, and I'm a committed omnivore, who would argue that any grain we feed to cattle or pigs or chicken is wasted, because we are not putting it to its highest and best use in terms of efficiently feeding humans. There are those who would argue that corn that we're producing for ethanol is wasted food because that productive capacity could. So I could spend the next 45 minutes telling you, and it's clearly very emotional. It's clearly highly contentious. So what I would argue is that we should take a look at where organic matter comes into the system, where organic matter comes out of the system, and say, are there ways, from a business perspective, from an environmental perspective, from a variety of perspectives, that we can more efficiently allocate those? So it's very good that what we're doing, but perhaps we would be more effective if we looked at it in a different way. This is sort of a simple, quote-unquote simple, overview of a supply chain or a value chain, and became the framework within which this graduate student who I was talking about, Michael Ann Hayhoe, this is her graphic, looked at entire systems, much like Martin does, and says, where are we creating, where are we losing organic matter, and why are we losing it? The next question is food waste bad? I mean, I think the reason that Martin and I and Molly and other speakers were invited here to speak about food waste is with the assumption, that we need, because of the word waste, because of that emotionally charged word waste, that we should be throwing less food out. But I have spoken many times to groups, in fact, once in this room, where someone stood up and said, food waste isn't bad. Look at all the people that we're employing in agriculture. If we threw less food out, farmers would get less money. We'd have fewer people working in food processing. Damn it, Mike. We need food waste to drive this system. Okay. I said back to that individual who said that to me, I said, but that's a bit like, you know, if there's some disagreement about how much we throw out, there's some disagreement about how much we throw out, but say we use the example of at the residential level, we're throwing out about 20% of the food we buy. What we say is, you know, if you go to the grocery store on Saturday, you come home with 5 bags, leave one at the curb. When you go into the house, it'll save you a trip back out. But what if I were to say to you, okay, well, we're going to go to Oakville Ford plant, and we're going to take every 5th car that comes off the assembly line, and we're going to launch it into Lake Ontario just to keep people employed. Is that really, really our best way? The other thing is, and some of my colleagues in FAIR would say, well, it's cheap food, we're just doing what the market is telling us. Heard Martin say, sometimes it's cheaper to throw it out than it is to find another home for it. Sometimes and again, Molly, I'm teasing Molly's great presentation now. I'm not taking things away from her presentation. But, you know, we go to big box stores and buy big packages because they're cheaper than the small packages. And then it sits in the back of the fridge until it gets a little sketchy, and then sometimes not even until it gets a bit sketchy, but we'll leave that. So maybe we're not, and then the next question is, are we dealing with the externalities? Are we accurately reflecting the environmental cost or the resource cost that went into those food products? And could we, in fact, reduce food prices in the context of food insecurity if we threw less of it out? So, I think, as I said before, we need to redefine the issue. We need to get away from the word waste. We need to talk about where organic matter in the system is going and ask the question if that's the best way for us, whether it's environmentally, whether it's from a business perspective. And I think that, I believe fundamentally that the word waste is one of the biggest barriers in making progress. We had a graduate student, Kate Perizzo in geography, and I had a graduate student who went out to talk to people in industry about regulation relative to food waste. And often they would say, no, we'd rather not talk to you. We understand. So it's not even just people in the home, right, what I'm throwing out, but businesses feel that they have some risk, that they don't want to talk about it. They don't want to acknowledge it. And I think if we could move away from that, we could make more progress. Talk about organic flows. Can we move things to higher uses? Can we move things up that triangle? Move away from the emotional terminology. Maybe it'll allow us to make better policy. Which begs the question, should this be a policy issue? Again, in the time I've got, I'm not sure we're going to address that, but it clearly is a policy issue. We've got Environment and Climate Change Canada, we've got OMAFRA, we've got other provincial ministries, we've got municipalities who are really at the front edge, at least of the residential food waste battle, or saying we want to do things about it. So if we are going to make policy, we should be thinking about it differently so that we can make better policy. And we need to establish priorities as we understand better. I think some of the things that Martin and his group are doing, and some of the work that we're doing here at the university and others, are really at the stage where we're saying we need to understand some of these flows better. Because to a significant degree, what's happening is ready, fire, aim. We see municipalities investing significant resources in interventions to try and get people to throw less out without having any idea of why people are throwing things out. If you say to someone, do you know that it's costing you X dollars a week what you're throwing out? and they're throwing it out because they're worried about food safety, you're going to make no difference to that individual at all. And understanding that becomes critical. And I'm going to echo what Martin said earlier. There are unlikely to be simple solutions. This is a complex problem. In individual companies, the causes and causes of waste or causes of inefficient organic flows, if I'm going to follow my own advice, are different. But that difference also exists at the household level, which is a much bigger challenge because we have. So that is kind of a little bit of an overview and introduction, some context. I'm going to now take about 10 minutes very quickly and go through a couple of different studies to say, look, here are some of the things we're finding. Here are some of the things that are helping us understand the issue a bit better. Michael Ann Hayhoe, who is hopefully be defending just after Christmas, did a look at, much like Martin talked about, at 3 value chains. Looked from start to finish at where waste happened. She didn't spend a lot of time quantifying it because, frankly, her objective at the beginning was to quantify it, and people wouldn't talk to her if they were going to get measuring. They would be willing to talk to her about sort of generally where things are at. So she looked at 3 value chains from start to finish. Apples, dairy, and leafy greens, trying to look at various degrees of perishability. Apples are easier to store than leafy greens. Dairy is sort of somewhere in the middle, and also had a higher degree of processing. And she looked for similarities and differences. And again, I've got about 5 minutes to do several things here. So I'm going to just give you some high-level generalizations from her results. Cost and availability of labor at the farm and in handling going up was a significant cause of loss in the system. Sometimes it wasn't worth harvesting or shipping because it would cost more to bring it off. An order was canceled, prices went down. Sometimes I had a good market for it, but I just couldn't get it off the field because I couldn't find good. We have a crisis in farm labor, I would argue, in this country, and that ties the cost and availability ties significantly to product value. Product standardization, and again, I didn't want to repeat a whole bunch of what Martin said, but we saw his graph. It's not just consumer standards that matter. It's not just the fact that we won't buy it unless it's pretty, although it's interesting that we will buy something at a farmer's market that we would look aghast at in a grocery store. You see an imperfect tomato sitting on a table at a farmer's market, you think, oh, that's cool, that's authentic, that's real. You see that on the shelf at Zehrs, you'd go, what the hell are they thinking? Where is their quality control? So standardization is an issue, and it's not just an issue in terms of fresh product looking good on the shelf at retail. It's an issue for processing too. That if that carrot isn't perfect, it won't fit into the machine to be diced or whatever. And so out of spec don't make it to the market. Economies of scope and scale. Smaller food processors, smaller producers, smaller retailers are all more likely to have higher levels of waste than larger ones. From an operations perspective, they have to hold larger inventories. When things go wrong, it tends to be a bigger chunk, so on a percentage basis, things go wrong. Economies of scope matter too, and scope means the variety of things we can do. So we looked at some small cheese processors who were specialty cheese processors, and some of the byproducts and some of the components that they didn't use, they didn't generate enough of them to ship them somewhere else, so they got thrown out. Whereas if we'd have been a larger scale cheese processing plant, we'd have diverted some of those things to another. So sometimes just being able to divert. We are going to look at hospitality services here at the university. They're keen to have us come take a look at what they're doing. And one of the things that I would argue is if you've ever been down in the basement of the university center and looked at what they do on a large scale there, it's amazing. But the amount of organic waste that comes out of that kitchen is smaller, I would argue, on a percentage basis than almost any other food service operation I've ever been in. Because they really think of diverting. They work hard at saying, okay, this doesn't make spec for a Subway lettuce or Subway tomato, but it can go into this. And they're making stocks, and because they have a wider variety of choices, they can divert things significantly. So scope makes a difference too. And product valuation. It's another way of saying cheap food. People don't think about it. It's cheap. It's easy. A friend of mine used to work in a restaurant for a large chain, and they had hard-coded into his bonus formula a range of waste that they were allowed to generate. And he was really conscious of keeping it low, and he got it below the bottom end of the range, and he thought, yes, I've done a good job. And he was penalized because the company said you can't get waste that low without ripping off your customers. And so we sometimes have institutional barriers as well. So we can come up with some broad generalizations, but the real challenge is, and it gets back to what Martin was saying earlier, is some of these differences are unique to individual companies. And if you really want to make progress, you have to put yourself through a process like Martin spoke about and say, where can we make progress? We've also done quite a bit of work on residential food waste. We've done audits. This is a lot of grad students in here, and we've done a lot of these audits historically with graduate students, so that's, living the graduate student dream. But I've been out. It's amazing what you can learn when you're there actually collecting the data, when you actually look and see what's there. Now, I will admit I haven't been out there as many days as the graduate students, but we audit everything that gets put to the curb. But that's only a portion of consumer waste. It doesn't consider what you ate outside the home. It doesn't consider if you compost. Because usually we try and do it where people don't know they're being audited. Actually, when you put your garbage to the curb, the city owns it. And if the city tells us we can grab it, or if they grab it and we look at it, now if you come chasing us, we'll give it back. But we also did some surveys on attitudes and behaviors to develop an understanding of not only what comes out of the house, but why it comes out. Very quickly, average household generates about 3.5 to 4.5 kilos of food waste per week. That's in Guelph. These are Guelph numbers. We have some brand new data, and I think, if anything, the numbers from this year are a little bit higher than that, probably closer to 5.5 kilos per week. 55% of that is avoidable, which means it's something you could have eaten. 36% is unavoidable, which means it's a banana peel, or it's an apple core, or it's chicken bones or something that you can't have eaten. And we've got the number in the middle, possibly avoidable. Possibly avoidable is where researchers like us say, no, you could have eaten that. So we're going to count it as unavoidable. And municipalities who don't want to offend people say, oh, no, we don't expect you to eat that, and they put it in the unavoidable. And like peels, not banana peels, but apple peels. Some people choose to peel their apples. Trying to think of another example. So we generally put that in the avoidable. Municipalities generally put it in the unavoidable so as not to offend taxpayers. But it's important to understand the unavoidable. There is some organic matter that we're going to throw out because we eat fresh fruits and vegetables. And it's important to understand that. It's important to acknowledge that. And I think it's important to differentiate. We don't want necessarily for that number to go down. From a public health perspective, we've been encouraging people to eat more fresh fruits and vegetables all along. And so what's interesting is there's not a strong correlation between unavoidable and avoidable fresh fruits and vegetables, which means some people are buying fresh fruits and vegetables and eating them, and other people are buying fresh fruits and vegetables and throwing them out. They think that they get credit for the 6 to 8, or what is it? What is the requirement? 5 to 10, sorry. 5 to 10 helpings of fresh fruits and vegetables a day means you have to do more than buy it and then throw it in your green bin. But not everyone believes that. Excuse me. Fruits and vegetables are about 50 to 60% of the total. I think that's consistent again this year, pretty close. 40% of it is unavoidable. High frequency, almost everyone throws stuff out. And it's 70% of the full avoidable total. This is, it's well after breakfast and not too close to lunch. This is a picture of actual sorted waste, and you'll see, I mean, we had to sometimes discourage graduate students from taking stuff home. And I'm not kidding. We weren't allowed to. But there was stuff, and these same graduate students thought it would be funny to feed me stuff that they dumpster dove for without telling me, and it was fine, and then we did it again afterwards. But this stuff is all, I didn't eat it, and I wouldn't, but this isn't sort of that English cucumber that is liquid in the plastic. This is all stuff that looks good. I have a picture. I get 2 minutes, right? Best before dates, worst understood piece of information on food packaging that there is. It is not a sign of food safety. It is when that manufacturer thinks that product will remain at its peak. And we find stuff in the garbage before its best before date. So there are lots of reasons. So I'm going to skip a couple. We've identified people who care about waste throw less of it out. One of the best predictors of how full your green bin is how well you sort your green bin, your garbage and your recycling. The worse job you do at sorting, the more food you throw out. The food aware, the more you care about food, the less of it you throw out. I am going to skip because I think I'm out of time. We've also done it in the restaurants. Quick quiz. This was the largest thing on the menu. We found when we did plate waste studies that what's the biggest thing people hear? Oh, well, portion size has gotten too big, right? We're feeding people more and more. We found a very, very weak correlation to portion size, and really it was a much stronger to composition. High carbohydrate plates generated more waste than low carb. So sandwiches with fries generated bread or fries coming back. This fish and chips was the biggest 700, almost 2 pounds of food on your lunch plate, ladies and gentlemen. Generated one of the lowest amounts of waste. Looking at that plate, a quiz to finish off. What got thrown out on this plate? The garnish. A piece of kale. Who's going to eat a raw piece of kale? Almost every single plate came back with kale. What did they do? They changed it to a couple of carrots. You still had a beautiful little bit of color on it. People ate it. We didn't throw it out. The lemon. Almost always came back. Right? No one's going to eat it. They might, might squeeze it onto their fish, but not necessarily. Anything else? The tartar sauce. Half of those tartar sauces, fully half of those tartar sauces came back untouched. Untouched. Oh my God. Why don't we ask people if they'd like tartar sauce? They did it, waste went down. So there it is, tartar sauce, the leaf of kale, a couple of fries, but the big things. Here's a carbohydrate-rich plate, clubhouse with fries, fries and bread came back. Smaller plate, higher waste. So I think I'm actually on time. Good. Shameless self-promotion. You can, if you have questions, I'm happy to answer emails. That's my Twitter. I tweet on food, including food waste, if you'd like to follow. And I am happy if there's time to answer any questions. Oh.
Forming policies around trying to reduce food waste. Do we know of policies that are actually encouraging food waste at this point? Have you taken any time to take a look at that, like say food safety, these best before dates, these requirements that are being put on really food processors and food providers in order to provide that food safety? Because I would imagine that would be a huge part of the waste problem, food recalls and things like that. And then also how have food recalls improved food waste with having better tracking or
we have looked a little bit at some of those things at the household level. We haven't looked too much at the processing level yet. As I said, I believe best before dates are a huge contributor, not only at the household level, but also at the retail level. So if we have people who are worried about best before dates, then as products get close to the best before dates, they don't even get put at the shelf anymore. So here's a product that is still at its prime that is getting taken off a shelf because we won't buy it because we have a misunderstanding of what a best before date means. So I think that there are some policy issues that are, some people would argue that having an organic stream actually increases the amount of food we throw out. Now, you could argue that composting it is better than throwing it into the and the information, the data is equivocal. We've got some data that we should have a better sense. We have 2 large municipalities, and we have done large scale, sort of 750 households for 4 weeks. So we should be able to compare an organic a community with an organic stream to one without an organic stream and get a better sense of that. We haven't looked at the issue of recalls and how and we're never going to get to a system where we are not diverting at least some of the organic matter from our food system to composting or something. We're never going to get there, but improved traceability should make that better. Is the fact that we don't have it making it worse? I think that's hard for me to say. I would argue that the fact, if you look in outside residential, everyone has to pay to haul their garbage away, so there is a much stronger incentive to reduce waste, and those costs are going up. So throwing stuff out at the restaurant or processor level is more expensive than throwing it out at the household level. I live just north of Guelph in Wellington County, and we have to buy bags to put our garbage in. We don't have an organic stream. The evidence is that that cost isn't very much. It's not changing behavior, and really the only change in behavior you see is that people try and is that the garbage is denser. they try and pack more into the bags. So rather than putting out 3 bags, they put out 2 bags with the same amount of stuff in it. They just push harder on it. And we also see a lot more in Europe. They've seen a lot more dumping in parks and things like that. So the charging for bags hasn't made a whole lot of difference. But there is a strong disconnect at the household level between the cost of disposal and the disposal itself, because garbage pickup is paid out of general taxes, where you pay a check, you pay your taxes 2 or 3 times a year, and it goes to, you know, in behavioral economics we'll say that we compartmentalize this, right? This is my house insurance, or if I'm a renter, it's part of my rent. So there is absolutely no cost at the household level to throwing stuff out. So I would argue that that probably increases food waste. But we haven't looked too hard at the policy issues further up the value chain. That's on the list.
Okay, so if I can if you can ask him the question during the break, that would be great. So we're going to take a 10-minute break now, and then before lunch we have 3 more speakers. So please grab some coffee and eat some